Right, my first question is, you talked about resistant training and how it improves glycemic control in older adults with type 2 diabetes. Can you briefly talk about that? I think there was a study that you mentioned.
Yeah, okay. Well, prior to the 2000, resistance training was not even on the radar for the exercise management of people with type 2 diabetes, mainly because of the fears of potential blood pressure rises that can occur with resistance exercise. But what we've started to understand is that having good muscle strength is an important part of the quality of life. If you've got sufficient amount of muscle strength, you can undertake the tasks of daily living, like carrying the washing out to the clothesline and all those sort of things. So what we were wanting to see is whether doing resistance training can lead to improvement in diabetes management, that is glucose control. And in this age group of around about, or over the age of 60, we were able to show after 6 months that the average decrease in HbA1c was around about 1.2 percentage points. And then when compared to a control group who didn't do resistance training, that decrease was around about 0.8 percentage points. Now that translates, if you use the UK PDS example of where a 0.9 percentage point reduction that was achieved in that study translated to improvements in reductions in diabetes complication risk. If we can if we can keep people maintaining that resistance training over a prolonged period, it could be beneficial for reducing the risk of complications. But definitely in the short term, we can see changes in HbA1c that are equivalent or comparable to what is observed with pharmaceutical intervention over similar periods.
Okay, very good. And you mentioned the big challenges in terms of exercise is resistance training, is stickiness. And you said home-based resistance training compared to something outside. Can you just comment on that?
Okay. When we talk about stickiness, we're talking about maintenance of behaviour change. And in this case, behaviour change is resistance training. We know that we can get people to initiate or start resistance training, and it leads to favourable improvements. But when we look at maintenance, that is, once you take away that supervision and you ask people to undertake it in their own time and using their own equipment, we see that it's less beneficial. It doesn't maintain the improvements in blood glucose control, muscle strength and the like. So the challenge that exists here is how do we start to incorporate strategies to overcome this stickiness issue, sticking to the program. And what we're starting, we've got a current study at the moment where we're actually adding on top telephone behavioural counselling. So regular telephone calls on top of strength training to try and see whether that can lead to more favourable maintenance, overcoming the stickiness.
Do you think there's a motivational aspect?
I think there is definitely a motivational aspect, and the important thing is that not everybody is the same. And so tailoring your approach to that individual requires this sort of advice, which that individual may not require that advice, but it requires different advice. So I think it's tailoring it to the individual. And using the telephone has been shown in numerous studies to be a wonderful tool in getting that motivational aspect across.
Okay. And then you had another study focusing on maintenance, and it was a community center-based training study. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, in that study, what we looked at is whether we gave people gym memberships for a 12-month period versus a group that was a control group that didn't get the gym membership. They only got one dumbbell to undertake the exercise. Whether adding that on top of an initial 2-month of strength training in our controlled laboratory, adding on top the 12-month in the gym would lead to favourable changes in HbA1c. And what we observed is that that was the people who went out into the gym who were able to sufficiently maintain the improved HbA1c that was observed in the initial 2 months after the 12 months. But the home-based group, they basically had gone back up to where they first started in terms of HbA1c. So what that showed to us is that the community-based centre, community facilities, could be an important source for maintaining this behaviour.
So on top of the phone
No. And the next study now that we're looking at is using the community facility and adding on top of that telephone counselling. That study is due to be completed in June 2010, which I think will start to show us whether we add these behavioural strategies leads to more favourable maintenance of that or overcoming the stickiness.
And you said you can be active but highly sedentary, right?
Well, this is a new concept, and it's important for us to now start to understand that just focusing on such a small part of the day, if we emphasise people that have to do a minimum of 30 minutes of exercise a day, that is just a small piece of the day when you look at the whole of day. So a time a person goes to wakes up to the time a person goes to bed, there's 16 hours in the day. So if we're just focusing on this 30 minutes, what's happening in the other 15 and a half hours? And in our modern society, the sitting has been engineered into our daily lives. Sitting at home, sitting in transportation, and sitting in the work setting. So what we're starting to observe now is that there are unique associations of having high amounts of sitting time on waist circumference, glucose, triglycerides, irrespective of a person's physical or exercise levels. So what this is leading, the question is whether just doing your 30 minutes is enough to offset the bad effects that occur when we're sitting. The important distinction here is that too much sitting is a distinct class of behaviour to not doing enough exercise. I can do high amounts or low amounts of sitting, and I also could do high amounts or low amounts of exercise, and they can coexist. I can be a high sedentary person and also a high exercise person, and the reverse is true.
And you mentioned prolongers and breakers.
Yep, this is another concept where we're starting to characterise how a person accumulates their sedentary time is a factor in increasing risk. And what we've been able to observe with using accelerometers is that we can characterise people who are spending long periods of time just sedentary or sitting versus people who are breaking up their sedentary time more frequently throughout the day. That is getting from sitting to standing and walking around. And what we have observed, when you make that comparison between prolongers, long periods of sitting, and breakers, you're getting more favourable health outcomes like lower waist circumference, lower triglycerides, lower glucose in people who break up their sedentary time. Now, importantly, this is independent of how much sedentary time takes place in the day.
So you said, this is an addition and not an alternative to regular exercise.
This is very important, and it's been well known for many years that exercise is important for improving health. Yes, that's a given. But what we're saying now, that in addition to that, we have to think about when we're not exercising, what are we doing? And in most cases, for a lot of people, we're sitting a lot, which if we think about in terms of energy expenditure, sitting is only barely above energy expenditure that occurs when we're resting, lying down in bed. So we've got very low energy expenditure that occurs when we're sitting. And in our Australian studies, we're seeing that up to 9 hours of the day can be spent sitting.
And then just very quickly to wrap it up, the translational program we talked about, Lift for Life, an attempt to translate research into the community. So that's happening now.
Over the last 7 to 8 years, we've been working on this initiative of taking what we've learnt in the research setting and trying to translate that into a community-based program. And in 2004, we were very fortunate to be funded by our federal government to take this program and put it on in terms of a national program, and it's called Lift for Life. And there's two key elements of Lift for Life. Firstly, it's a structured exercise program based on what the research protocols were. The second is that the trainers out there in the facility are given additional training to be able to deal with people who may have diabetes or may not have type 2 diabetes, but also to give them training on appropriate programs to get that benefits, those benefits in health.
And it's a couple of years now since it
Yep, it's a couple of years now, and there's around about, in Australia, there's around about 70 facilities who are licensed to undertake this program. There is a website for it. It's just life.com.au. And there are some that have been very successful facilities, and then there's some that are still working on developing up their clientele.